Just let me know when your Instagram's up.
Yeah, it's up.
Good?
Looks like it's yeah, we're good.
Okay, cool. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Money Conversation series with me, Kara Francis, and Elizabeth Michelle. A little bit about me. I am a former divorce attorney turned marriage and divorce coach. Still practicing law on the side a bit, but coaching is my primary focus these days. So yeah, it's safe to say whether in marriage or divorce, I've definitely seen a lot when it comes to conflict resolution, especially about money, which is our topic today. But before we dive in, Elizabeth, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Hi everyone. I'm glad everybody's joining us for the Money Conversation series. I'm actually excited about this topic too. So I am Elizabeth. I am a money coach. I help women with all things money from personal finance and also working on their relationship with money and feeling more confident and better about money. I also support couples to help them build stronger communication around money and figure out how to manage it together in a successful and peaceful way. Yeah, so I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, I feel like talking about money, even when there's no conflict, can be difficult. So if there is conflict, it can feel that much more overwhelming and stressful to resolve because there's already so much energy and emotion sort of attached to these conversations. So I'd love to hear just sort of your thoughts on how to approach these kinds of conversations.
Yeah. So I'll be honest because I know we've both kind of we have had our experiences with past relationships. And so one of the things I've learned early on is initially in my relationship, I kind of avoided money because I wanted to avoid conflict. I avoided talking about it. And now, and especially with my work with couples, one of the biggest things I always suggest, and I think also works for me, is defining what your roles are as far as how you want to communicate. Like coming to the table with your intentions with this discussion. For example, assuming that both of you have good intent, that you both want each other and your relationship to win. So that could be one of the intentions that you set. Some of the other rules could be when you talk about it, making sure that you're agreeing on a time that feels good for you, that you can both give to that discussion. One other rule I really liked that one of my couples came up with is being curious.
Mm,
So instead of making an assumption about what the other person is communicating, just be curious and ask more questions and really make sure that you're understanding and hearing what they're saying. And also, I think it gives that other person reassurance that you really want to make the effort to like meet them in the middle or really understand where they're coming from. What
mm.
about you, Kara?
Yeah, I love some of those. I want to expand upon them a little bit too. But I think one resource that I would love to share with everyone, because I've been learning a lot personally with just managing any difficult conversation, money or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a book called Difficult Conversations: How to Discuss What Matters Most. And I can share it in the comments once this gets posted. But the authors of that book do a really good job of breaking down some of these concepts that you mentioned, among others. Um, so just throwing that out there, just for life in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, the embracing the curiosity. So we each have our own unique way of seeing the world and our own we make our own interpretations about the world as we see it, because that's how we survive. That's how our brain helps us survive. It's, what's the story that we're telling ourselves in order to
Mm-hmm.
understand the situation. um, what can create conflict is when my story doesn't match your story, and so that's where you can find yourself sort of arguing about whose perspective is correct. And that is a dead end road. You're not going to get anywhere with that because they're not going to be able to change how you see the world, and you're not going to be able to change how they see the world, nor should you try. So one thing to keep in mind is would you rather be right, which is subjective, or would you
Mhm.
rather be happy, or would you rather move forward and solve this problem? So when you come across a conflict, one place to start is by, like you said, getting curious, exploring each other's stories. Don't assume that you know everything there is to know about the situation. You know what you know, and stay curious about what they know and how they see this situation. Um, which also sort of weaves into what you said about intentions. So
Mhm.
there's this idea of intention versus impact. So you may have good intentions. That doesn't erase a bad impact, because the way somebody is impacted by a situation, again, is determined by that person's unique perspective of the world and their own feelings, which we can't control. So, a lot of times, what you hear in difficult conversations is, well, I didn't intend that, or I didn't mean for that. I don't intend to hurt you. That may be true. And this person is still entitled to feel the way they feel. So, don't assume that just because you have good intentions that the other person's the way they receive it is not valid, because it is
Mhm.
valid for them. As well as, like you said, don't assume that they have bad intentions just because you're disagreeing. This is, you guys are a team. So money, if you feel like you're being defensive, sometimes that can mean you're in more of like a scarcity mindset of like you're feeling threatened in some way. And so, yeah, like you said, just remembering that you are a team, or attacking the problem, not the other person. Um, so don't assume anything.
Yeah, I love that. And I love what you said earlier about, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? I think that's so good because a lot of times when we're in a relationship, being right doesn't really serve you. I think in most circumstances when you're
Yeah.
having conflict. Um, and if you approach it like that, we ultimately our goal is to thrive and be happy. That's such a great perspective shift. And you got to take the ego out of it too, I think. A lot of the times we bring our ego into it. And, I've been guilty of that. I've been very fiercely independent and, taught myself a lot about money. And I think that was one thing that I probably brought more into my earlier relationship is just like, well, I know what I'm doing. So why do I have to talk about it? But I think just being humble and taking your ego out of it can really help too. And I think sometimes that can be hard. We're all like adults and probably have been surviving on our own before we get with our partners. So sometimes you just have to like set that aside.
Mhm.
Um, One of the other things that I think really works too is grounding into your values and boundaries and communicating those. And I'll give some examples, I think, because I know a lot of times when I talk to people that are not quite sure how values relate to money.
Mhm.
And values to me are just really like what are the things that you live by, or what defines how you want to experience your life, and what are
Mhm.
the things that really fulfill you. Um, and an example can be, because one of my values is autonomy. And so that to me incorporates independence and really being able to shape and lead my life in the way I want to.
Mhm.
And that does inform how I manage my finances. I mean, it informs me going and pursuing an entrepreneurial path, because I know that gave me more control over not just my career, but also my money.
Mhm.
And knowing that sometimes you do have to make adjustments with your finances because ultimately you want to be autonomous. Um, so sometimes you have to, prioritize certain things. Like initially, when you're an entrepreneur, you have to know that it's going to be challenging to start building up your business, and it might not feel as secure as something like a W-2 job where you're getting a steady paycheck.
Mhm.
Another thing might be travel. Travel could be something that is part of your value system, and maybe you like experiences over purchasing things. And communicating those and understanding those with each other can help you then take that next step and figure out some common ground and how you make those work together. I think it also helps you decide if your values differ or your boundaries differ. Is that okay? Are you willing to like work with that? Or if you're earlier on in a relationship, maybe it's something you want to take a step back and evaluate if that's okay with you. Um,
Hmm.
and then, as an example of a boundary, this comes up a lot because when I talk to couples, one of the things we do is kind of talk about all these big money topics and how they want to handle them. And one of the things that comes up is how do we manage our finances when it comes to family? Do we want to incorporate taking care of aging parents? Are we okay with co-signing loans for family or giving money to family? And what are our boundaries around that? So being upfront about those things, I think, can also help you with grounding into what that foundation is and then navigating the conflict together.
Hmm. Yes, values, like you said, drive the way we want to live our life. They're like we each have our own personal like 10 commandments for anybody who's like Catholic or whatever out there. Um, of like this is how I want to live my life. And they don't have to match your partner's exactly. In fact, that would be probably more the exception rather than the rule because I feel like we're all so different. But yeah, like you said, which of these are inconsistencies or misalignment that I can live with and that we can still have a thriving relationship with versus which of these are really going to eventually down the road cause either or both of us to feel resentful or frustrated or like we're not living our true lives. Um, and that goes to what we've talked about in the past, in our past lives, which is the earlier you talk about money, the better, because each of these values, like you said, impacts money, whether it
Mhm.
is travel or I want to raise a family or I want to be a very charitable person or I want to live in this city or anything. And so all of money is the means by which a means, not the only, but is a means by which we live out those values. It's a tool that
Yeah.
we use to live out those values. And so if you guys aren't aligned on how you want to use money to live your lives, then that's something that needs to be discussed and then determine do we still want to move forward down this path together? Um, and I think for something that is tangible and black and white like money, it all like what we value and the decisions we make all come back to our emotions. And so I think another aspect of resolving conflict and any on any issue, but money in particular, is making sure we don't suppress those feelings, making sure that we fully express those feelings in the conversation, because that really is what is driving each of us. A lot of people think if we talk about feelings, it's going to get too messy and we're going to end up in a fighting match and we're not going to resolve the problem. But if you don't directly address them in a respectful way, they will find their way into the conversation, whether directly or indirectly. And it usually causes the conversation to be not as productive. So, one way to sort of successfully express your feelings in this type of conflict is first to check in with yourself and identify what am I actually feeling, because sometimes there's so many different ways to describe our emotions. So whether you look at a feelings wheel or if you're a Brene Brown fan, Atlas of the Heart is a really good resource that describes all of these different feelings. um,
Mhm.
get clear on what your feelings are, express them fully and respectfully to your partner. Really focus on the I statements. So, like when, I feel X when this happens. Don't blame the other person for your feelings. Don't attach any judgment to your feelings. Simply express your feelings. There's room for everybody's feelings. So make sure that you are giving them space to express their feelings as well. And most importantly, is to acknowledge and validate each other's feelings, because oftentimes the reason why conflict can't be resolved is because one or both people feel like they're not being truly heard and understood, which is like one of our core needs as humans, is to be seen and understood. And if we don't have that need met, we can sometimes dig our heels in on something that doesn't even really matter that much, or something that might be easily, logically solvable, but there's this big block in the way, which is the emotions of it all.
Yeah. I love that you brought up the emotions and feelings part. And I'm curious, in your work with couples, has there been any like exercises or routines that you found successful to help come to a discussion emotionally regulated? Because a lot of times I think when you're talking about money, we're thinking about running numbers and looking at a budget. And we don't necessarily think like, how do I like get myself into a state where I'm emotionally regulated, and what does that mean so that I can communicate my feelings in a productive way with the I statements, and also be present to validate my partner's feelings and experience. So has anything worked in your practice with couples for that?
Yeah, I think like we've mentioned, focusing on the I statements. So don't assume you know how they are feeling. Don't assume that they intended to make you feel bad. Don't blame them for anything. Simply say, I feel X because
Mhm.
when this happens, or um, I feel scared because growing up, my parents really struggled to make ends meet, right? So, like, providing some context behind the feeling, but again, keeping it to the I statement, as well as like sometimes I feel like when we're sharing our feelings in conversations, the other person in the back of their mind is getting defensive. And it's important to realize that each of you are entitled to your feelings. Each of your stories is true for you. Again, this isn't about who's right and who's wrong, or you have no reason to feel that way. It's so, so important to release all of that before you have this type of conversation. Because if you don't, you're going to quickly go into that default mode of defensiveness, of trying to prove that they're wrong and you're right, and you're not going to get anywhere. Um, so, leading with the I statements, acknowledging their feelings. And this is important. You can acknowledge their feelings and their experience without agreeing with it, right? So, you
Yeah.
don't have to adopt their perspective as your own in order to acknowledge them. So, for example, acknowledging and validating when I don't agree with your perspective would sound something like, I can see how if you would, if this were true, you would feel that way. Or like, I could see how you would feel that way given dot, dot, dot. Right. And this is not you abandoning your own perspective. This is not saying like, this is not admitting fault or what have you.
Yeah.
This is just showing them that, like, on a human level, if I were in your position, I could understand how you would feel that way. So there's an art to it, but once you pick up on it, I think that's helpful. And then the last thing I'll offer, and then I want to hear your thoughts, is one of my biggest pet peeves, which I do this sometimes too. I'm not perfect, but I more so notice it when I'm watching other people have conversations, is someone will say something like, I understand you feel that way, but
Hmm.
you got to remove the but,
Oh, yeah.
because but negates everything that came before it. And it's another way of saying, but you're wrong, but that's not true, because it is true for them, right? So
Mhm.
adopting the and stance, or simply ending that sentence with a period and then starting your next sentence, like that one little word can create so much negative energy, because as soon as the other person hears it, they're like, oh, they're already trying to tell me that I'm wrong, or that I have no reason to feel this way. So that little word of but carries a lot of weight.
Oh, yeah. And I think that I totally agree. It's also kind of like when you say you're sorry, but it's like, if I did this to you,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I call
It
it the Real
totally just
Housewives apology.
negates. Yeah,
I'm sorry you feel
exactly.
that way.
So I'm totally there with you. Um, just talking more about emotions because I think it's so important with this conversation. And one of the things when you know you're going into a conversation and there might be some topics that could turn contentious or challenging, going back to like setting the stage, one of the things that I think is it works as well is even like doing some breathing exercises before you get to the conversation, like 3 deep breaths both people take to just like center themselves. Or maybe like have your money date after you both have either like gone for a walk or maybe you both have your workouts if you work out together or separately because you're just like releasing whatever energy there is and then you're coming kind of fresh because I think physical activity is so good for releasing any of that like pent up emotional energy so you can be more clear headed. The other thing, going back to having your rules for communicating or your operating agreement, is predefine what giving yourself a timeout looks like. Make it okay to give yourself a timeout. So if you are having the discussion with your partner and it does start to get heated, you can just say, you know what, it feels like we're getting heated and I'm not sure we're gonna solve this right now. Let's take a time out and come back to this. And when I say define is decide what timeout looks like. You could, decide on a magic word or a safe word or whatever you want to call it. And then how much time do you want to allot before you come back to revisit? Because you also don't want to leave the topic open too long, because I think at some point it's harder to come back to, and it might make one or both of you feel like your feelings or your experience is not important enough to come back and kind of validate and rediscuss. And money is really important. So you want to make sure that you don't leave things open too long that it bubbles up into something bigger or you build resentment. And usually what I say works is like if you have a money date, maybe don't give yourself more than 24 to 48 hours before you like come back and revisit the conversation. So it's still fresh in your head, but you can come back to it with a different perspective.
Yeah.
What do you think has worked for you when you're in a conversation and it does turn contentious? What are some of the things that you feel can help couples bring it back so that they can still feel good about being able to solve it together?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, taking breaks is one of the best ways to do that. I know I personally, when I start to feel myself, I know when I'm personally in a space where I'm not going to be able to productively contribute to the conversation, everybody has their own tell. My tell is I just start to shut down and I
Yeah.
just start agreeing to everything, but like in a it's fine way, which is like not good. So
We
I
have that in
know
common.
yeah, it's fine, but like it's really not fine. Um, so really do some reflection with yourself and think back on prior conflict that you've had and get to know like what your tell is when you've kind of crossed that line into I'm not able to have a healthy conversation anymore because now I'm dysregulated, which is okay. And this was also hard for me to accept because I'm a recovering perfectionist. I like to like check things off the box. I like to tie everything in a neat bow. Okay, we have a problem. Okay, now this problem is gone. Relationships are more muddy and complex than that. So
Yeah.
it's okay if you don't resolve this issue within a 30-minute discussion. It's okay to sort of leave it open. But like you said, there's a balance between leaving loose ends indefinitely versus taking a break that's helpful for both of you and then coming back to the table. And like
Yeah.
also looking at it from the situation of like, you're never done talking about this.
Mm.
You're never done with certain issues because the only thing we can count on in life is that things don't stay the same. Things are always changing, things are always evolving, and it's about how can we work together to get through the current state of our situation until the next change comes. And so I think focusing on that teamwork aspect of like, okay, this is how we addressed it last time. Now XYZ has happened, so this is no longer working. So how can we approach it differently? It's almost like solving a puzzle together. And so yeah, I think my biggest tips would be know thyself, know when
Mhm.
you know what it means when you've become dysregulated, take a break, and come back in a way that is more of a team approach because your partner is not the enemy here.
Yeah, yeah. I know we talked about prenups and like some of those topics that come up that could very well be something partners disagree on and require multiple conversations, because I love what you said is like you're not done, and you also don't have to be perfect. You can decide together what's good enough and keep going and iterating on the conversation as long as you keep communicating about it. um, so thinking about some of those topics that maybe can get more heated, and maybe you do have an argument about it, or it just feels really tough to navigate through. What do you do when you disagree? Maybe like I decide I don't want a prenup and my partner is like very adamant that we get one. How do we resolve conflicts like those that we just have such a hard stance with each other? And like what are some perspective shifts that you feel like really helps with something similar to that, or doesn't have to necessarily be prenup? Maybe it's like one person is really adamant that you combine all the money and have all joint accounts, and the other person really wants to maybe have a joint account and have some of their own accounts, and like they keep kind of butting heads on that. What are
Mm.
some of the perspective shifts to help work through some of those that just feel like both of you feel really right and like really grounded in what direction you want to go in?
Mm. Well, I think some of that goes back to, what are your negotiables versus non-negotiables?
Yeah.
Things like whether or not we have a prenup. That is a situation where somebody's going to feel like they're making a sacrifice. There's a difference between compromise and sacrifice. And
Oh,
if
that's so
you
good.
are
Yeah.
sacrificing something that is of value to you, that is what creates that resentment. Um, Versus a compromise is a situation where both of our needs are met, maybe not perfectly, but we both feel comfortable with this arrangement. So I think it comes back to that dilemma. And when you get curious about what's driving each of your positions, like what is the need or the interest behind this position that I want all of our money to go into a joint account? That's a position. So what's
Yeah.
behind that? What's driving that? And how can we, is this the only solution to meet that need for you? And usually it's not, right? Usually there's multiple ways to satisfy each of your needs. And so staying curious and not getting stuck in those different positions is what's going to be helpful. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is, does this feel like a compromise or does this feel like a sacrifice? And it's going to be pretty clear. A sacrifice, you're going to feel pissed off. You're going to feel mad. You're going to feel resentful, or you're going to feel like you are abandoning yourself, or you're already regretting the decision. Whereas compromise, you're like, this is not my ideal, but I can live with this. It's not going to keep me up at night. So getting really clear, and again, that comes back to doing that inner work first, which is what I help my clients with a lot, even before they get married, is like getting really clear on what's important to you. That way, when these things happen, you already have that foundation of self knowledge to remind yourself, because when we get into the relationship, sometimes those emotions can take over. And so it's important to
Yeah.
remember, oh, I already did this work with myself. Like now I need to apply this to this current discussion and see what's negotiable versus what's not negotiable.
Yeah. I love how you described the account topic as like that's a position, and really take a step back and think about what need you're trying to meet. I think that goes back to also just discussing what's the end goal for whatever this topic is. What does success look like to both of you? And maybe that is also a shift of perspective. And like you said, you can find maybe an alternative solution that still works for both of you, meets that need, and gets you still to that goal.
Mhm.
And I also like the distinction between sacrifice and compromise, because that's so true. You really have to be very clear and be okay with sticking to your non-negotiables and your boundaries, because what you don't want is to enter into an agreement and then it builds resentment and creates more issues.
Right.
So yeah, it can seem hard to communicate those, but I think if you do keep the doors open to have the communication, take the pressure off of not having to resolve everything in one conversation and just be really honest and curious and coming to that discussion with good intention, that you can have a really successful discussion where both of you can talk about money and also work on resolving conflict together in a way that feels like you're a team and that's more peaceful and serves both of you and the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that's a good place to sort of wrap up, which is this idea of conflict is not bad, right? Conflict
Yeah.
is really is an opportunity for you to learn more about yourself and your partner, to grow, to evolve as humans and as a couple. So it's not conflict in and of itself that can harm the relationship. It's how you handle conflict.
Yeah.
So really remembering like conflict is not the enemy. Conflict is inevitable because again, our world that we live in, like things are going to come up. So it's about how we handle this together. So yeah, I love what you said about just keeping the big picture in mind. What's the goal here? Um, and how can we come together to reach that goal? Um, so yeah, any other final thoughts or tips or resources that you would like to share before we sign off?
I love that conflict book, The Hard Conversations. I think he said it was. I think that would be great to give to the audience. I'm going to check that out too.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, just again, I love I totally agree. Conflict is not a bad thing. It's an opportunity to continue to work on your relationship and grow together. So I think if we can think about it that way, that can also help with just taking the stigma off of having disagreements. So yeah,
Mhm.
thank you,
Totally.
Kara. Such a good discussion.
You. Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, if anybody has questions, feel free to leave comments and we will get back to you. And thanks for being here.
Yeah, happy Tuesday.
Bye, guys.
Bye.